English made easy. Hey guys! Bored of those vocab lists? Me too. At 1 Degree North Companion, we're turning wordly wise into an adventure to make learning actually interesting. Let's jump in.
You know how some words just paint a picture in your mind? Well, for one incredible American sound, that word is bluegrass. And believe me, the story behind it involves a whole lot more than just grass. We're talking rolling hills, legendary race horses, and a full-blown musical revolution. Today, we're going to unpack that story, how this music journeyed from the Appalachian Mountains and took on the entire world.
So, let's start with the name itself. Bluegrass. It sounds pretty straightforward, but you have to wonder, how in the world did a type of grass become the name for this incredibly high-energy, soulful music? Well, the connection is way more fascinating than you'd probably guess.
For a lot of people, especially anyone who follows horse racing, the word bluegrass instantly conjures up a very specific, very powerful image. We're talking about Kentucky, right? The bluegrass state. You see those beautiful rolling green hills, home to some of the most famous and celebrated racehorses on the entire planet.
But then, for music lovers, that very same word paints a totally different picture. It's the sound, isn't it? The sound of a string band just hitting that perfect, lightning-fast harmony that makes you want to stomp your feet. It's amazing how one single word can pull two completely different worlds together like that.
The name actually came directly from those incredibly lush, blue-green pastures of Kentucky. And here's a fun fact, the grass really does look kind of bluish when it flowers in the spring. So, the man who basically created the genre, Bill Monroe, he just named his band the Bluegrass Boys as a shout-out to his home state. But the name became so iconic that it stuck, not just to the band, but to the entire style of music.
Now, to really get this music, really understand it, we've got to go back, way back, long before it even had a name. We're heading into the Appalachian Mountains because that's where the seeds of this sound were planted, mostly out of pure necessity.
Just try to picture it for a second. You're living in a remote mountain cabin. There's no radio, no movies, no TV. Entertainment isn't something you just turn on. It's something you have to make. The settlers there, a lot of them Scottish and Irish immigrants, brought the old folk tunes from their homelands with them. And this music wasn't just a casual hobby. It was the heart of their social life.
You could say their isolation obliged them to make their own fun. It literally made it necessary. If you could play a little fiddle or even just carry a tune, you were a vital part of the evening's entertainment. And that's exactly how those ancient melodies survived, passed down from parents to children, generation after generation.
But hold on, those old Scottish and Irish tunes? That was only part of the story. The music was about to get a shot of something new, an influence that would change it forever and turn it into something uniquely American.
So, after the Civil War, African Americans began moving into Appalachia for work, mining, logging, building railroads, and they brought their own deep, powerful musical traditions with them. And that included an instrument of African origin, a four-stringed instrument made from a hollowed-out gourd called the banjar.
The sound of this new instrument was just incredible. It was sharp, rhythmic, a little bit twangy, and it turned out to be the absolute perfect partner for the smooth, singing voice of the traditional fiddle. This wasn't just adding another instrument to the band. This was a complete and total game changer.
And I mean it when I say it was the perfect complement. The banjo didn't just play along with a fiddle, it completed it. It brought in elements from the blues and early jazz, that syncopated, rhythmic drive, that percussive punch that the music never had before. This incredible fusion of cultures was creating a brand new sound right there in the mountains.
And then came the final piece of the puzzle, the guitar. Traveling musicians from the cities brought it to the region, and it just filled out the sound perfectly. It gave the music a solid foundation of chords and bass notes, a floor for the fiddle and the banjo to really dance on.
So, there you have it. By the late 1800s, all the essential components were finally in place. You had the fiddle carrying the melody, the banjo driving the rhythm, and the guitar holding it all together. The sound was there, just kinda simmering and evolving in the mountains, but it still didn't have a name, and it didn't have a champion to take it to the rest of the world.
And that's where one man steps onto the stage. The person who would come to define, name, and popularize this incredible new sound for everyone. And his name was Bill Monroe.
Monroe was born in Kentucky back in 1911, and his life really traces the entire history of the genre he pretty much invented. He formed his band in 1938, and over the next 10 years or so, he and his Bluegrass Boys would forge those signature lightning-fast tempos and that high-energy playing that we now all know as bluegrass.
Now, Monroe wasn't just some bandleader. He was a true virtuoso. The man showed unbelievable prowess on the mandolin, even when he was just a kid. He completely changed how the instrument was played, taking it from something that just strummed chords in the background to a blistering lead instrument capable of these unbelievably fast and complex solos. And then, the arrival of radio in the 1920s changed absolutely everything. All of a sudden, there were commercial opportunities that just didn't exist before. For musicians like Bill Monroe, playing music didn't have to be just a hobby anymore. It could actually become their life's calling, their vocation.
So, how does this story end? Well, here's the best part. It doesn't. Today, the spirit of this music is more alive than ever. It's celebrated in festivals all across the globe, thousands of miles from the Appalachian Hills where it was first born.
If you ever get the chance to go to a bluegrass festival, you'll see what I mean. The atmosphere is just so down to earth and welcoming. There are no velvet ropes, no real separation between the stars and the fans. The performers, even the really famous ones, just walk around and mix with the crowd. It honestly feels like one big family reunion.
And you can really see this community spirit in the impromptu jam sessions. They pop up everywhere. People just pull out their instruments in the parking lot, around a campfire, anywhere, and they just start playing together. It's completely unplanned, totally unscripted, and it's just pure musical joy.
For so many of the fans and musicians who gather at these things, the festivals are a way to pay homage. It's a way to show public honor and respect for the entire tradition. They're honoring the music's deep multicultural roots and, of course, the father of bluegrass himself, Bill Monroe.
When Bill Monroe himself was asked to describe his music, this is what he said: "It's got a high, lonesome sound." And wow, does that capture it perfectly? That soulful, powerful vocal harmony that sounds like a voice calling out across a huge, empty mountain valley. It's a sound that was born in isolation, but now it speaks to the entire world.
You know, we've seen how Bill Monroe took this thing he loved, this music, and turned it into his life's work, his vocation. It kind of makes you think, doesn't it? If you were going to do the same with your own hobby, what kind of prowess, what incredible skill would you need to build to make that dream a reality?
Hope you guys enjoyed that last lesson. If you did, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell. Ready for more? The next one starts right now.
Today we're diving deep into the world of one of the ocean's ultimate survivors, the harbor seal. You know, these animals are just absolute masters of their environment. They've got this whole toolkit of tricks that lets them thrive in some of the toughest conditions on the planet. So, let's get into it and see exactly how they pull it off. Okay, take a close look at this rocky shoreline. At first glance, it just looks like a jumble of stones and seaweed, right? Kind of empty. But I promise you, hiding in plain sight is a true master of disguise. Have you spotted it yet? There it is, the harbor seal. And its ability to just vanish into the background like that, it's not just some cool party trick. It is a critical, life-saving adaptation. This incredible natural disguise is what we call camouflage. Camouflage is really the seal's first line of defense. By blending in so perfectly with those seaweed-covered rocks, it stays hidden from some serious predators, like great white sharks and orcas. It's an evolutionary masterpiece, really. And the secret? Well, it's all in its coat. The seal's coat is described as mottled, and what that means is that it's covered in these patches and blotches of different colors, usually grays and blacks. This pattern is just perfect for mimicking the colors and shadows of the coastal rocks, making the seal practically invisible to anyone who isn't looking really closely. But, you know, hiding is only half the battle. To actually survive in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, well, that requires some serious internal engineering. So let's take a look at how these animals are literally built to thrive in the bitter cold. To insulate something means to protect it from the cold, and harbor seals are absolute experts. They've got two main layers of protection. First, a coat of really dense fur, and then, right underneath that, a super thick layer of blubber. You can basically think of it as their own personal all-weather wetsuit. Now, this blubber layer is amazing because it does double duty. It's not just one thing. First, it acts like a thermal shield, keeping the seal's core body temperature stable, even in icy water. But it's also a fuel tank, storing up energy that they can burn through during lean times when food might be hard to find. Now, this is what I find so fascinating. If you see a harbor seal on the rocks, you might think it's kind of lazy. It appears lethargic, slow, sluggish, maybe a bit clumsy. But the second it slides into the ocean, it's like a totally different animal. It transforms. Its body becomes sleek, and it moves with this incredible grace and power.
The contrast is just stunning.
Underwater, a seal can maneuver with just breathtaking precision. It uses its powerful rear flippers to literally rocket through the water at speeds up to 15 miles per hour. It can make these hairpin turns to chase down fish or, get away from danger.
Okay, so let's go back to that seal on the rocks that looked so lethargic. It turns out that basking in the sun isn't about being tired at all. It's actually a vital biological process. What they're doing is replenishing their system. Basically, they're refilling their blood with oxygen to get ready for their next deep dive. And this brings us to one of their incredible superpowers. Seals have muscles that are packed with a protein called myoglobin, which is fantastic at storing oxygen. So, in essence, it works just like a built-in scuba tank. This allows them to hunt for a really long time in those murky depths without having to come up for air.
And for their second superpower, what happens when the water is so murky you can't see a thing? Well, they use their whiskers. But these aren't just any whiskers. They're hypersensitive vibration detectors. They can feel the tiniest movements in the water made by a swimming fish, letting them track and hunt prey in complete darkness. It's like having a built-in sonar system so precise it can map a fish's escape route from several feet away. Amazing.
So, while the seal is perfectly adapted to its natural world, its relationship with humans, well, that's been a lot more complicated. It turns out their biggest challenge hasn't been the cold or predators, it's been us.
Can you believe this? In the 1800s, this was the price on a harbor seal's head in the state of Maine. $5. It's shocking to even think about today, but it tells such a powerful story about how much our perspective has changed.
The state actually offered a bounty for each seal killed. And you might be asking, why? Well, an adult seal can eat up to 20 pounds of fish a day. So fishermen didn't see them as these incredible survivors, they saw them as competition. And because of that, they were hunted relentlessly. This timeline just shows the incredible shift in our thinking. We go from a state-sponsored bounty in the 1800s all the way to a landmark piece of legislation in 1972, the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And this wasn't just a small change, it was a profound turning point. It was a national commitment to finally valuing these animals as a vital part of the ecosystem, not just as pests.
Today, the law makes it illegal to harass a harbor seal, and that means a lot more than just physical harm. It means keeping your distance, not disturbing them while they're resting on the rocks, and just respecting their space. It is a complete 180 from the policies of the past.
So, that brings us to today. The laws are now in place to protect them, but the survival of these animals really still depends on us and our actions. We all have a role to play in this story.
Think about this for a second. A seal pup is weaned, meaning it stops feeding on its mother's milk at just 6 to 8 weeks old. After that, it is completely on its own. It's just this tiny creature, facing the vast, murky ocean and all of its dangers all by itself.
During those first critical weeks, the mother seal is constantly on alert. She keeps a wary or a very watchful and cautious eye on her pup. Because these pups are so vulnerable, it's the mother's job to protect them and to teach them everything they need to know. How to find food, how to stay safe.
And this brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with. Imagine you're a volunteer on the coast. You see people getting way too close to a mother and her pup. Using what you've learned today, how would you explain to them why we absolutely must not harass these wary animals, especially when they're on shore, just trying to replenish their energy for the challenges ahead? The answer is now yours, and it's a responsibility that we all share.
Thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed today's show. If you did, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss an update. I'll see you in the next one.